My name's Dan Billow. I was a reporter for 33 years for WESH 2 and covered the space program.
Excellent. What was the purpose of STS-107? What was the point of the mission?
What was the purpose of STS-107? The mission was a space lab mission, so there was something like 80 experiments being flown, experiments that could be done only in space. And most of this took place in a lab carried in the back of the space shuttle. And that's kind of important because that made it impossible for them to carry a robot arm on this mission, which could have been very useful. It was also kind of a public relations mission too. The first Israeli astronaut, Ilan Ramon, was on board. So those were the two purposes of the mission.
Tell me about the coverage of the mission and in the media coverage, the spotlight that was on this particular launch and crew because of the things you just mentioned.
The spotlight that was on this mission and crew was largely on the Air Force colonel from Israel, Ilan Ramon. And anytime you get an Israeli, in that era, in that day and age, a prominent Israeli is going to be perhaps the focus of terrorism. And so that was kind of, for the media, that was the big thing. The heavy security, the Air Force presence, the hotels cordoned off and roped off, and all kinds of things to make sure that Ilan Ramon would be safe and not would be some kind of target of terrorism.
So the mission was set to launch in, if I'm correct, in July of 2002, was that correct? And was it delayed?
It was delayed any number of times, yeah. By the time they got going, they were a couple of years behind schedule by the time they finally launched in January of 2003.
A little bit about the crew members. Who were they? What were their expertise? Had they been veterans of other missions?
Yeah, they were quite a mixture. Rick Husband was the commander. Rick Husband was somebody who everybody loved. He was that likable guy who was in control and in command and did it in a way that whatever you were doing, he made you think it was your idea. He made you think that you were the best at it, and so likable, very faithful. Before the mission, he, the most important thing in his life was Jesus, was his faith. And before the mission, for example, he wrote out 17 Bible lessons for his kids, one for each of the 17 days they'd be gone. That was Rick Husband. Willie McCool was the pilot, a young guy, a go-getter, a military pilot like all space shuttle astronauts. You had, again, you had Colonel Ilan Ramon, most of these astronauts had kids. Ilan Ramon did. These kids were there on the runway and watching them come home when all of this happened. Ramon was no exception. Had his wife there. Was a guy who was, never thought he'd wind up in space, but when the idea came up to President Clinton at the time that this was proposed, he was the one who was selected. So he became somebody who was just, absolutely a household name in Israel. And so when this happened, it certainly was an international, a great disaster in certainly more places than just the U.S. Laurel Clark was a mom. Laurel Clark, she's so interesting. Her family had been in something, kind of a minor aircraft accident just a couple months before. They were private pilots. Their plane crash landed and they were okay. The plane was ruined. The boy, her son, was there in the plane. He had a premonition, this child, that this mission, this space flight, was going to end in disaster. He begged his mother not to go. He begged her not to go. And then it happened. It happened while he was running around playing on the runway, waiting for her to be, she got that close. She got that close. And then it happened. There was Dave Brown. Dave Brown was carrying a watch for a woman he had been seeing to give her as a gift. She worked here, the Kennedy Space Center. And he took that, and it was a surprise. Took that watch up for her, and anything flown in space is special. So he was going to give that to her after the flight. Well, that watch somehow survived all of this and was found on the ground and given to her with the hands frozen at 9:06, 6 minutes after the breakup of the shuttle. And that watch was falling through the sky, fell all the way to the Earth and was recovered. Mike Anderson, payload commander, and Kalpana Chawla, I think, is the final crew member. She was from India. And so there again, you have, very, very few Indian people have flown in space. She had flown before. She had been kind of a lightning rod for criticism because the high profile mission that she had done was to try to capture a satellite with the robot arm. There's a satellite floating out there in space. She was the one to try to grab onto it with the robot arm. It didn't work. She messed up. This was kind of redemption for her. To be assigned to another mission was redemption. And then she didn't make it back home.
Did you have an opportunity to interview them before they launched?
I had the same opportunity that the other reporters around had. The astronauts hold a news conference before the flight, and you can ask any questions you want, and they hold a little news conference at the runway when they arrive at the Kennedy Space Center before their flight. So we had, you kind of get to know their personalities just a little bit, not too much, but when you spend a couple of hours at news conferences and things, you ask a few questions, you get to know them a little bit.
Anything stand out to you from those opportunities that you had?
Yeah, I think the only thing that stood out was probably what I said about Rick Husband, that his charisma, his likability, his charisma, and his, dead-on competence. You would trust your life with this guy in 5 minutes, easily. That came across even when you didn't know him very well, even when you could kind of watch him from afar.
In your pre-launch coverage, right before it went up, you said the line, 7 people putting their lives on the line for science. That was quite foreshadowing. Do you remember saying that? Did you say that every time there was a launch? I'm very curious as to why you said that.
Well, I was always mindful, and especially right before liftoff, I was always mindful because of being through things like Challenger, that this was a risk of life. That was a pretty high risk. 2 space shuttles out of 125 is a pretty high risk deal, and they may have been lucky to do that well. So I was mindful every time on every mission that all these people and what they were doing, they knew that they might not make it back. And they sat down with their families and their sons and daughters who may not have wanted them to go, and so on and so forth, and really, had to search their souls about, should I do this? It comes down to anybody's choice. We would all love to go to space, I think, but we don't want to take the risk to go to space. I'd love to be in space, but if you offered me a ride on the space shuttle, I would have said no. And but they said yes because they thought it was worth it. They really, honestly thought it wasn't. This isn't PR. They thought it was worth it, and they died heroes.
Take us back to launch day. What do you remember of launch day?
Launch day. What I really remember of launch day was the security, and knowing that there were extra military aircraft overhead ready to shoot if needed. Wasn't needed. The extra security of getting Ilan Ramon from the Hilton in Cocoa Beach, where he was staying with his family, getting here. That's what we were all focused on, and focused too on somewhat the fact that this would be one of the last non-space station missions. That they were doing this in a science lab, so really unable to go to the space station, which was kind of in its infancy, but it was up there. And there were people on board, and it was a refuge that Columbia could not use. Not really thinking of it in those terms at the time, but knowing that this is one of the last times, if not the last times, that they would go into space and not have a space station mission. And as it turned out, had they gone to the space station, they'd be alive today.
When did NASA know that the piece of foam broke away and struck the left wing?
NASA knew the foam broke away the day after launch. This was a 16-day flight, so there was a long time to study and know about, and if anything could be done, do something about this foam strike. So there's a team at the Kennedy Space Center whose job is to study the high-resolution, high-speed film and video taken with all these cameras that are pointed at the shuttle as it's going up. And after Challenger, when the imagery and the film and the pictures were not so good, which was a bad idea not to have every camera in the world pointed at the space shuttle so that you could see what was going on. In 2003, the camera views were great. And this team spotted right away that there was something big that came off of the space shuttle, off the external tank, and hit the wing. So NASA knew within 24 hours. And people here at the Kennedy Space Center were getting very concerned about that within 24 hours. But they were unable to make their superiors concerned. And they were pretty much told to go away, we don't care about this.
When did you have an idea that something had broken away?
I was probably not aware of the foam strike until the day before landing. The day before landing, there was a routine pre-landing news conference held by the flight director. And he was asked a question or two about it and talked a little bit about that the space shuttle was hit by a piece of foam that came from, piece of foam insulation that came from the external tank of the shuttle and hit the orbiter itself, hit the left wing. In some way, they couldn't tell from the views that they had of exactly where it hit the wing. They thought it struck the underside, but they weren't sure. And he said, we're not sure about a whole lot of this. We really don't know a lot about it. And that right there was an alarm bell that went off, not knowing about it, not knowing enough to really talk in very much detail about it. That's trouble right there sometimes. And so I think that's what kind of got me interested right away. He dismissed it completely and said it's no safety of flight issue, the astronauts are at no risk, but I reported it anyway because there were unknowns about it. And unknowns I learned from NASA. Okay, NASA taught me that unknowns are bad, and you try to do everything you can to get rid of the unknowns and to know what you're talking about. And yet here he was saying, well, we don't know a whole lot about this, but it's not really a safety of flight problem. Well, how do you know if you don't know anything about it? So that struck me the day before. So I made sure I put it out there, put it on the record.
I remember hearing you ask a question of the mission director when this was brought up. And it might have been a follow-up question. Was that just you trying to probe and figure out what the heck is this? Is an unknown. What the heck, like, how much do you know? I mean, what made you kind of drive that?
Well, yeah, I don't know how many questions I got a chance to ask specifically about the foam, but I wanted to know about the foam because, again, alarm bells go off when they bring something up and then say, but we don't know a whole lot about it. And so that's why I wanted to know more about it, but it seemed like mission managers didn't want to know much more about it. They were kind of dismissing it, and in part saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it anyway, so never mind.
So that story that you're talking about right now, so you wrote the line, mission managers are certain the minor damage is no threat to the astronauts' survival. Could you fathom that the absolute opposite was going to come true the next day?
No, I would never have thought that it would be, catastrophic. But that it could be worse than what they were saying. How much worse? How do I know? I don't know. And again, in space flight, that is why you look at every unknown with great skepticism, suspicion, and curiosity, and do all you can with it. And so that's what struck me, is that the skepticism and curiosity and the drive to find out didn't reach the top. It did reach the lower levels. There were people who were just terribly concerned about it, but they were somehow not able to communicate that to the top.
What was sort of your morning like leading up to the broadcast? Did you have pre-show routines, or how did you prepare for a landing and to broadcast a landing?
Well, one thing how I prepared for a landing was, one thing I would do was my homework, and kind of brush up on exactly what the different milestones were as they left orbit and came home. So I would kind of study up on that and get there early and try to not miss anything that NASA was saying. All the while doing the other kind of half of my job that every TV reporter deals with, was making sure that everything worked on this end and the other end, and put out all the fires that you have to put out in this business when, they can't see you, they can't hear you, that you're not communicating with the TV station. And so I spent half the morning going, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? And because of that, missing what I was supposed to be doing, which was paying attention. But finally it came through.
So, do you remember the coverage plan for the return of Columbia? Because obviously it was a big deal. That had been this international mission. Everyone was watching. What was the plan? They were going to land. What were you going to do?
What we were going to do was just document the safe landing, we thought, of the 112th space shuttle. We were going to be again concerned with Ilan Ramon, focus more or less of what the news media kind of cared about, which was the possible terrorism angle, of which there was not a whisper in real life. It was just something that caused a lot of security, the security was successful. Nothing bad happened. So we were going to talk about that it had all ended, and that that the astronauts had made it.
I want you to kind of explain to everyone how you monitored what was happening with NASA while also broadcasting live on television.
Yeah, what I always insisted upon, and which was sometimes hard to make happen, hard to get the bosses to agree to give me the resources, I always insisted that I must hear what was coming from NASA in one ear, independently, nothing else in that ear, hear Channel 2, for example, Raul Martinez, the anchor that morning, hear him and my producer and the program, what Channel 2 was broadcasting, in the other ear. Had to be independent. I had to have two monitors, two TV sets in front of me, not one. They only give you one. I wouldn't take one. I will not do this with one. And I had to yell and scream and throw a tantrum a few times. I'm going to have two monitors. One is going to be for what's happening with NASA. One is going to be Channel 2. Well, if NASA is on Channel 2, why do you need two monitors? I need two monitors, and I will have two monitors, okay? And this was an example of needing two monitors, because there's one thing on Channel 2, and there's one thing going on in space, and I have to have it undivided as much as possible attention on what is going on and not miss anything.
We heard you in the broadcast say at one point that I'm not hearing anything from Mission Control. You thought that the audio was turned down. You said that.
Correct.
kind of walk me through, at what point did you have a sense something's not right?
It took me until 2 or 3 minutes before landing. And that is because, in part, again, we were putting out the fires, trying to get on TV, and they couldn't hear me, I couldn't hear the station, and we fixed that. The problem was, here I am broadcasting and talking about what the plans are to land and so forth, and I'm not hearing this ear. NASA's not saying anything. Well, that's because they had lost contact with the shuttle and they were being very quiet to try to get anything that they hear anything that they could. Well, you know, I kind of assumed that something else is broken. You know, we'd had a lot of stuff that didn't quite work as well as we wanted it to that day. Well, finally, they spoke up again, and I was able immediately. The moment they started talking about this, I knew that this hadn't happened before. They were supposed to be up there above us by the time that they were starting to say, well, we've lost contact, and that I was able to hear that. So not being in contact with the space shuttle at a time when they must be very close to Florida is a big, big problem instantaneously. I mean, that is absolutely the wrong thing.
So what we heard NASA say was that the Merritt Island tracking station wasn't able to find the shuttle, and there had been no communication with the shuttle for several minutes. And you said, immediately after that transmission on TV, you said, wow. And then we heard contingency procedures are called for. And you said, oh my goodness, that's unprecedented, that's not good. Where is your mind going at that time?
Where my mind is going at that time is mostly with the radar. And knowing that, you know, you have a big tracking antenna, a big radar dish right here. When you say Merritt Island, it's you know, within a mile of the Kennedy Space Center. It's right here. And a big dish that uses radar to find whatever is in the sky. That's not hard to do. You can find any airplane, you can find a goose with that radar. You can find snowflakes, you can find almost anything. And if they're not on that radar, they're not there. The shuttle doesn't exist. You know that immediately. It can't stop or slow down somewhere on the way here. It has to be here or it doesn't exist anymore. Those are the two things that you have. It has to be here. And the radar has to work. Now, you don't doubt the radar. The radar is easy. It's simple to find something in the sky, any aircraft. So if it's not showing up, that immediately is just, you know, alarm bells all over the place.
So you said they're supposed to be landing right now, but they're not. Where are they? They're lost. I'm gonna stop short of saying this is a disaster yet, but you're hearing what I'm hearing from Mission Control, and we're hearing nothing at all. And then you went on to say the space shuttle is not here. This has never happened before. They are gone. I don't mean gone forever. I mean they are gone as far as we know. When you said that, did you think that they're gone forever?
Yes, I thought that they must be gone forever. Like anyone, I wanted a miracle to happen. And, you know, when you're a reporter, you report what the official information is. So you wait for NASA to declare them gone forever. Now, that didn't happen until the president spoke at 2 o'clock that afternoon. And however, I thought that there was very, very, very little chance. You cannot parachute out of a space shuttle that's going 14,000 miles an hour. You know, there aren't any scenarios for this that end well.
How did you navigate that line of, with your knowledge of the space program and believing what you think happened, but being on TV and not wanting to declare something off? I mean, how did you navigate that?
On the fly. How did I navigate that? I kind of navigated it as best I could on the fly. It's not something that you can kind of plan for. But I kept in mind that, you know, if NASA wasn't going to come out and say that the astronauts have died, that I can't say that. How do I know? I wasn't there. On the other hand, you know, I know something about how space shuttles work and how they fly and what they can do and what they cannot do. And you cannot survive something that happens 37 miles high at 14,000 miles an hour.
So you stayed on TV for about 20 minutes, and then they basically evacuated you. Where were you? And kind of walk me through what happened there.
At that time, there was NASA would allow us to be near the runway, at the runway, the midpoint of the space shuttle runway, and there were platforms for some of us. We had the use of a platform that was up high, so you could see the runway a little bit better, and so that nobody walking around, because there were a lot of people who kind of would do that. You had to have permission to be there. It wasn't open to the public, but landing was kind of a picnic. You know, people would sit on a blanket. People who worked here generally were allowed to be here, might sit on a blanket and watch this great thing that you get to see only a few times in your life, and to be that close to it. And we had good access. So we were up on our usual platform, and once they declared what they call a contingency, the plan for that here, from the people who are in control, is take the media away from the runway. You know, I can't stay there without permission. It's the Kennedy Space Center. I don't run the place. So they forced us to leave. They said, you know, security's here, you guys are leaving. And you really are leaving, whether you like it or not. So we had to leave.
Network television took over to broadcast Something's Wrong, right? What happened to you here?
Yeah, we were kind of lucky that the network was there to kind of take over for me and Raul. So what we did then was get in our van, our news van, and drive about 2 miles to here, this building where we sit today, and have to reset everything up again to get ready to do live TV, and that takes a little bit of time, but maybe 5 or 10 minutes after getting here, we were able to be capable of going on the air again. I don't know how long it was until we actually did, but we got all set up and ready to go back here. So it was a drive of 2 miles in our own vehicles to get here and just reset everything up.
At what point did you start to connect, hey, foam fell off the fuel tank, they said it wasn't a big deal, but maybe it's something? I mean, when did you connect those dots?
When did I connect the dots of the foam strike with the loss of the space shuttle? Within something like 5 or 10 minutes of landing time. So landing time was 9:16. So by 9:20, 9:25, while I was still at the runway, I was talking about that, and we were queuing up the recording that we had of the flight director talking about it and giving what little information he did give us, and replaying that. Then I was just talking about, you know, one avenue of investigation, of looking into what went wrong, is going to have to be, was it this foam strike? We didn't have the information yet that Mission Control had that morning, that things like the tire pressure in the landing gear had gone to 0. And when you have no pressure in your tires, it probably means they popped, because they got so hot that they just popped, exploded. Mission Control knew that, but that part of the communication, though it was released later, was not released that morning. We didn't have that little bit of information. So all we knew all I knew, most other reporters hadn't been paying attention. All I knew was what I had heard the day before, was that there had been something that hit the wing, and there was a lot that was not known about it. And now they were going to have to find out if that indeed is the thing that killed the astronauts, and it turned out to be.
So when they brought you back over here, did they hold a press conference and tell you anything, or did they just go kind of media silent?
Yeah, it was silence. There was no announcement, and really it would be pretty hard for NASA to say much more than what James Hartsfield, the commentator in Mission Control, was saying, that a contingency had been declared, that the last communication with the crew of the space shuttle had been at 8 o'clock Central Time, 9 o'clock our time, and that they were trying to figure out what went wrong, and they were going through what they call their contingency procedures. Contingency means backup. The thing you do if plan A didn't work, contingency is plan B. So that's all that they were saying at the time, and I think that was pretty fair, and I think it was pretty transparent of NASA, after all, to open up when they could. And that very day, the administrator of NASA was talking, and the president talked, and we did get some information from the head of the shuttle program before the end of the day. And that was tough to do. That was hard for them to do. They were just ashen-faced. Their emotions were just barely under control, and yet they took the time to try to inform the public of what they could that very day. And that was a pretty good job, and it was a lot different from what happened in Challenger, which was a lot more silence.
Did you see families being moved around that morning?
Yeah, what we saw of the astronaut families would be typically, they were in an area where reporters couldn't go. And if you think back to Challenger, there is an unforgettable shot done by Dave McGuigan of WESH TV that day, on January 28th of 1986, where at that time, now this was a launch, the families, in this case the family of Krista McAuliffe, the teacher, were in the bleachers, and the news cameras could focus directly on the families. And that's what they did. And of course, what everyone thought was, this is going to be great, and they're going to be cheering, and it's going to be wonderful, and there's going to be this great launch. And the shuttle, what was it, 72 seconds after liftoff, disappears in a ball of smoke and flame. And here is the family of Krista McAuliffe. Close up. It's dawning on them. It was intrusive. Wasn't meant to be, but you almost don't want to watch that. And so from then on, the families were kept away from the press and the news media, and the news media we were okay with that. I thought, and I think everybody else thought, that was appropriate. So they were on part of the runway where we couldn't go, but we could see them in kind of the distance, a couple hundred yards, not that far away, and we could see them stirring around. You knew what was happening. You knew that they were being hustled away. Again, you had all these kids. 3 or 4 of the astronauts had kids in the range of, some were very young, 2 and 3 years old. Almost all ages, 6 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old. Those age ranges, roughly, don't know the exact range, the ages. They were there too. Their moms or dads had just been killed. And they weren't told what happened any more than we were. They knew as much as I knew. But they were taken off to be taken to the family quarters here and to wait whatever was going to be told them.
So when you saw the footage coming back from Texas, what did you, expert Dan Billow, what did you see in those streaks across the sky and the debris that was on the ground?
What I saw, I immediately noticed, were a lot of spherical objects, kind of like basketballs made of metal. and knowing and hearing very careful commentary that we were getting from the network and from the stations in Texas and so forth, where they would be getting these shots of this stuff. And also there were a couple of shots of obviously panels of space shuttle heat tiles, the square tiles, and several other things. And I knew immediately what they were, and was hearing, nobody's talking about this, but they was very carefully saying, oh, this is something suspicious that's been found, and they've got it cordoned off. We don't know what it is. Here's something suspicious that seems to have fallen here or shown up here somehow, and we don't know what it is, but the authorities are interested, and they're kind of telling everybody not to touch it. Well, I knew what it was. That's fuel tank. Fuel tanks in space are round. That's the most efficient shape. You can get the most bang for your buck and most fluid when you keep it in a spherical tank. A sphere is also very aerodynamic and less likely to not survive the trip down from space, the fall from space. So these tanks would have survived, and it was easy to understand that. And the space shuttle has tanks of oxygen, of hydrogen, of hydrazine, nitrogen tetroxide, all kinds of things, and they're almost all, if not all, going to be spheres. So we saw a lot of those, and we saw a lot of tiles. And in hearing everybody being so careful not to say what it was easy to say what it was. It's what I just explained. So we were among the first to be able to kind of identify what nobody else was willing to identify or try to identify. I was able to do that because I've been here for years and years and years, and every now and then NASA will let us into the processing areas, the places where the space shuttles are kept in between flights and prepared for flight and maintained and so forth, and just to see the kind of the guts of a space shuttle. And again, there would be something wrong with a space shuttle somewhere in the bowels of the spaceship someplace, and you'd be reporting on that and getting pictures of it. And over the years, over 20 years or whatever it was, to do that so many times, you kind of get to know almost every part of the spaceship. Not as well as someone who works on it, but you get to know it pretty well, and it's easy to know this is that and that's that.
What stands out to you as sort of the most surprising aspects of the investigation and what it found?
I think what had to be the most surprising thing, kind of two things. One of the most surprising things was when the head of the investigative board said of the Space Shuttle Safety Organization, which was, they've got this organization, and it looks nice on paper, and there's an organizational chart, and there's a guy who's managing it and who's in charge and all this, but when you go and look under all that, as he put it, there isn't any there. The safety organization, and I repeat, the safety organization, this is an important organization. This safety organization was a shell. There wasn't any there. They didn't do anything. They did things, but they didn't have authority. They didn't do enough. They were a shell. And that was really surprising after Challenger. After not so many years and so many flights after Challenger, that this safety organization had been more or less budget cut to death. The other thing that was surprising to me was that you kept hearing quite a few times that when the concerns brought to management by the engineers who look at the launch cameras, the high-speed cameras, when they tried to bring their concerns higher up, the higher-ups said, well, there's nothing we can do about it anyway. How can NASA say that? How can NASA say there's nothing we can do about it? How can the failure is not an option agency say, well, there's nothing we can do about it anyway? Back in the day, it was, I don't care if it's impossible, do it anyway. Failure is not an option. Failure was the only option. Nothing we can do about it. Let's go home early today and not worry about it. That was unbelievable.
What did Columbia change with the shuttle program?
What Columbia changed was, at least temporarily, to revitalize the safety organization, to try to rebuild the failure is not an option ethos, you know, by doing things like equipping future space shuttles with repair equipment, so that if the same thing happened, maybe they could repair it in space. They could at least try. You know, I think it changed just the idea that you could say something like, well, we've had 110 or 112 flights and we've never had this problem before, so it's not a problem. In other words, with falling foam, with foam striking the space shuttle, they would say, you know, they were saying, well, foam is too light, too weak, there's nothing to it, so it can't do damage. Well, they didn't study that. When they studied it after the fact, it can do damage. It can make a big hole in the wing. So I think, I really think, you know, that there was a strong effort to make sure you don't say something without knowing what you're talking about and doing the tests and things like that, so you can be saying it and be able to back it up.
Why were mission managers so convinced that there was nothing that they could do to look for damage, and if there was damage, fix it?
Well, I don't know why, because I don't know why they were so convinced that there was nothing they could do, because they were the inheritors of the Gene Kranz legacy. These were the people, you know, Leroy Kane, I don't want to blame it all on him, but sat in the very same seat as Gene Kranz, the guy who said in Apollo 13, failure is not an option. I don't care that it's impossible, do it anyway. Sat in the same chair and said, well, there's nothing we can do. Again, I'm not blaming it on one guy. They all said that. Many of them said that. Some of them didn't, but those who didn't weren't able to win. So I don't know why that is. I don't know how that could be, that the failure is not an option agency became something else, but they certainly became something else. And, you know, have they recaptured that ethos with the SLS and the Moon program? I don't really know. You have to prove that when it happens, when the going gets really tough. You have to prove yourselves.
Why couldn't the astronauts on the shuttle tell if there was damage? Why couldn't they look and see what had happened when that foam fell?
Yeah, well, it's as simple as saying, you know, look out the window, look where the windows of the space shuttle are. And if you look at that, if you look out those windows, you would not be able to see the wing, or at least the part of the wing that was damaged. You can see the ends of the wings, the tips of the wings. Also, the payload bay doors are open, and that's a little bit of an obstruction too. So the astronauts, without any planned spacewalk, without a robot arm that's something like 50 feet long and has cameras and can look over the side if you need to, didn't have that. So for the astronauts, they just weren't equipped with that. Well, from then on, they were. And why wouldn't you do that? But then how many things have you done in your life, you know, you messed something up and then said, you know, why wasn't I doing it the right way to begin with? I don't, why? Same thing happened here.
What did the Columbia crew know about the foam strike?
They were told late in the mission, in a very carefully worded communication and email from Mission Control, that, you know, the first headline of it was, don't worry about this, there's nothing really wrong, but some foam hit what part of the wing, it looks like, or the underside of the wing. We've studied it and we've decided and concluded that it's not a safety of flight issue, but we're telling you about it, and I think they emailed them a little clip, a video clip of it actually happening. But we're telling you about it because you're going to be doing interviews with the media, and in case the media asks about this, you've been informed, and you can tell them that it's not a safety of flight issue and you're not worried. So it's sort of being told what to think. But that, I believe, that's all they knew. Just one, like 4 sentences, just one short email of, this happened, but we're not worried about it. We're really not worried about it, so don't you worry.
Was the foam strike, I mean, when you go back and you look at the launch, can you see it?
Well, you can't see it really much unless it's enhanced and pointed out. So the enhanced visuals of it, yeah, you can see it. And it looks benign, it looks inoffensive. You can't tell that at something like 80, 82 seconds after liftoff, they're going so fast that they ran into that piece of foam with the wing of the shuttle at 500 miles an hour. Now, the shuttle was going faster than that, but the relative speed of this slowly moving piece of foam and the very fast moving space shuttle was 500 miles an hour. So that thing hit the wing like it was fired out of a cannon at 500 miles an hour, and it made a hole in it.
Tell me how a cannon plays into the investigation.
A cannon plays into this because it took a cannon to prove that a piece of foam, where's the piece of foam? So it was a piece of foam insulation, something like this, about this size. It weighed 1.5 pounds. It was a little harder and denser than this foam, which is packaging foam. It was about this size, pretty close to this weight. Can this do any damage? You think it's impossible. But again, the relative speed of this almost holding still after disconnecting with the shuttle's fuel tank versus the space shuttle hitting it was 500 miles an hour. So the investigators took a cannon, and it is a cannon that's used for that, by the way. There's a research facility that fires little pellets at airplanes to test whether bird strikes are going to do any damage. And so they fire the equivalent of rubber chickens. They're not actually rubber chickens, but they fire the equivalent of that in some material at airplanes because airplanes run into birds. So they used that cannon to fire something like this, 500 miles an hour. And if this was fired, 500 miles an hour at your car, it would make a hole in it. It'd make a big dent in it anyway. When in the wind, goodbye. It's nothing. But at 500 miles an hour, it's a whole lot of something.
What haven't we talked about that is in your recollection from?
Two things we could talk about are sort of a timeline of getting home from space. Okay. Milestones, speeds, altitudes. Secondly, something that struck me that has been one of my strongest memories, which was the memorial service for Columbia on the runway here, which was a very different sort of memorial service than the big one at Houston with the president there and everything. So,
well, tell me about the memorial service here.
The Space Shuttle Memorial Service here at the Kennedy Space Center was held at the runway Columbia would have landed on, and held a couple of days after the big memorial service, where the focus was very properly on the astronauts and the two recovery people who also died during the search for the pieces of Columbia. And at this memorial service, it was different because The astronauts are in Houston, and they're the most important thing, without question. The space shuttle is here. The space shuttle is in Central Florida, or was. You know, we in Central Florida are the people who touch the space shuttle and fix the space shuttle and take care of the space shuttle and turn the wrenches and get it ready for launch and launch it. The space shuttles are here for us. So it was also a memorial for not just the people, the astronauts, but for an object, a spaceship, you know, made of bolts and wires and you know, aluminum panels. And Bob Crippen, who was the first person to fly Columbia along with John Young, and I have a picture of myself, which I really treasure, of with Crippen and Young. And you know, I'm happy to say that Bob Crippen and I have a friendly acquaintanceship. He's a really quite a man. So was John Young. And Bob Crippen spoke very eloquently about the space shuttle, about Columbia, as kind of a friend, as you know, it was the first space shuttle. And that space shuttle was falling apart for thousands of miles and tried to hang in there. Tried to hang in there, but couldn't make it home. And you know, I remember asking and thinking, can you love a spaceship? And the answer is yes. You know, that we here, the spaceships are special to us in Central Florida. You can love a spaceship. And we loved Columbia. And she died a hero.
I think that's something that a lot of people outside of Central Florida maybe don't think of, right? They don't think of all of the people who touch it and bring it to life.
Yeah, that's who we are. All of the people who touch it and bring to life, they're Central Floridians. They're Brevard County residents, they're Kennedy Space Center workers. You know, we, and I say we, I never touched a space shuttle. Well, I did a little bit, but you know, we are the ones who do that. That's why it's special to us. The astronauts are special to us just as much as they are anywhere. But the spaceships are the thing that we have that, you know, is Central Florida. That's only here.
Did it change? Did the shuttle program change after Columbia? Do you think that, you know, that loss of the mojo, the kind of that you were talking about, did everyone here truly say, never again?
Yes, they said it, but they knew that they couldn't absolutely make that promise because you're flying in space. What you can make the promise of is being vigilant as you can be, and work as hard as you can, but you can't say, we will never let this happen again in terms of losing a spaceship. It won't surprise me if it happens again, even though the new spaceship, the Orion and the SLS, is way safer. And you might get me to ride on that. Not that I'll ever have a chance, but it's way safer. But you know, for it to happen again, I'll believe that it certainly can happen again.
When the shuttle program went away, did you think that was the time? This is what should happen. We should move on to the next.
Well, yeah, I hated to see the space shuttle go, so I didn't want it to stop. But you know, it's clear that something built in the 70s and 80s and designed in the 70s and 80s should give way to whatever is next. That's, you know, and it should have done so probably sooner. But you know, what you shouldn't do is mount your spaceship on the side of a rocket like a butterfly bolted to a bullet. You know, what you should do is put it on top where it's safer. So we went to the new way when the new way was the old way. the way it was done in Apollo and the ones to go along with Apollo. So that was appropriate. That needed to happen.
Looking back on it, were you grateful that it happened at that point in your career? Do you feel like, gosh, all of my skills came together that day? What has that process been like for you looking back?
That process, and I won some awards and got a lot of credit for it, and wanted to give them all back because I wanted it to go away. I just, I wish it hadn't happened. But, as journalists, we have to have our best day when other people are having their worst. And when the hurricanes hit and the tornadoes hit and the spaceships do what spaceships do and all the other things is, I'm not saying we make sacrifices and are heroes. We don't. We're just doing our job. We get paid for it. But we need to be at our best at times when other people are having the worst possible day. And that's what happened here.
Can you walk us through the timeline of the return, how that works, like when they kind of wrapped up and started to head back, and what they would have been seeing and what would be kind of going on, just to kind of paint the picture for everyone.
Okay, yeah, so the timeline of this return to Earth with some milestones kind of superimposed over what happened with Columbia. It's about an hour before landing that they slow the ship down by firing rockets so it will drop out of orbit. And that's at about 220 miles high at 17,500 miles an hour before landing. About a half hour later, they're 76 miles high, and that's when they encounter the first little bit of atmosphere. And it's the atmosphere that slows the space shuttle down and enables it to decelerate from 17,500 to 0. So that happened about 900 miles northeast of Hawaii, northwest of Hawaii. Columbia crossed the California border at about 8:53 with landing at 9:16. It was going about 16,000 miles an hour by then and was starting to come apart. The astronauts were seeing what they expected to see. They were kind of enjoying it. It's exciting, that's for sure. Some of us might be terrified, some of us might be excited. But it looked normal to them. It took about 1 minute to cross all of California, west to east. And by then, watchers on the ground were seeing things fall off. And you could actually see the space shuttle as a streak in the sky because it's so hot. It's not on fire, but it's hot. So it gets to the Texas border at about 2 minutes before the breakup. So that's at 8:58. And by this time it's going about 14,000 miles an hour. And the astronauts are talking about, wow, it's really a light show out here. It's really getting hot. The space shuttle is in great distress at this time. Things are falling off the left wing. It's coming apart. They get just about right over Dallas. They're 37 miles high at that point. They're going about 14,000 miles an hour. It's 30 seconds until 9 o'clock Eastern time. That's when the shuttle breaks up. The tires have just exploded a few seconds before that. The space shuttle makes its last transmission to the ground that was picked up, and they're about 37 miles high again. A few seconds later, the space shuttle breaks up at about the midpoint. The wing comes off, the left wing, the space shuttle breaks up. The crew cabin is still intact. The crew cabin with the astronauts inside, alarms blaring, You know, the camera that Laurel Clark had been holding probably crashing around, other things possibly crashing around if they weren't tied down, tumbling. The crew cabin stays intact, or something like another minute and a half. And after the loss of communication, something like a minute and a half. And at that point, it is breached. It starts to come apart, and that's when the astronauts would have met their fates. In a normal landing, it would have been another 10 minutes or so before you'd get to the vicinity of Florida. Again, they're going slower and slower and slower. By the time they arrive above the runway, they're bleeding off the last of their speed. They're still pretty high altitude. They're making a sonic boom as they arrive. They do one circular flight off the end of the runway to kind of line up and to lose altitude, and then they come in for the landing. So the whole thing, about an hour.
You mentioned the tape that Laurel was shooting, and talk to me about how we know what was on that.
That was one of the most unbelievable things about all of this. Laurel Clark was shooting that video. Remember when we used to have video cameras instead of phones? You know, so it was a typical video camera that you might have had then with the tape inside of it, a cassette with tape, magnetic tape going around and around on 2 reels. And you know, the video from that is the astronauts chatting and being happy and kind of kidding with each other a little bit, but then also being serious about what they needed to be serious about, and getting their helmets on and, you know, making sure everything was ready to go. So this tape, this cassette of magnetic tape, somehow, after the crew compartment broke up, as I described, somehow it survived the fall to the earth. Didn't burn up, except the outer layers of it, which were the last parts of what would have been recorded. They were either damaged or possibly burned or just not there at the end by the time it fell all the way to the earth. Well, one of the recovery team members had been sent to this dirt road someplace where part of the shuttle had fallen, recovering that, saw this cassette tape looking thing on the road and picked it up and thought, well, you know, this is probably some kind of Merle Haggard or Johnny Cash tape. We're in Nacogdoches, Texas, but I'm going to throw it in here. And sure enough, it turned out to be Laurel Clark's camera's tape that survived all that way down. And so we have a record of the astronauts on their way down until something like 10 minutes or so before the breakup of the shuttle. I don't know exactly how far it got, but something like that. So you don't see any of what was going wrong that you know of, but actually it was. While she was recording, there were bits of the space shuttle coming off and falling off because the wing was melting from the inside out. Because hot air had gotten inside the wing. And here they are not knowing that. And that's Columbia. That's Columbia doing its, no matter what, trying to get home.
Can you talk about the last transmission, you know, just the eeriness about that, you know, that we hear about, and you can kind of rehash, but, you know, them saying we lost tire pressure, do you copy? Then you hear a little bit and then the clicks. Can you kind of talk about that and how eerie it was and how, you know, kind of it was the last thing that we ever heard from them?
Yeah, so the last moments that we're aware of, we became aware of better in terms of the public when that recording was released by NASA some weeks later of what all went on in the Mission Control Center. And you have sensors disappearing from the readout. In other words, so you've got sensors that show the temperature, that show the strain, that show various kinds of measurements going on over the space shuttle, including, of course, the left wing. And at first you lose a couple of temperature sensors. In other words, they go black. They're not working anymore. Well, no, there are more than 1,000 of these kind of sensors, and sometimes things don't work perfectly. It's probably not a big deal. And then something else a couple of other sensors in the left wing go. Oh, what is this about the left wing? And then the tire pressure finally, and they're starting to discuss this with Leroy Kane, with the flight director. Then the tire pressures go to 0. The tires lose all pressure. Well, these are the tires in the wheel well on the left wing. Everything is left wing. And when you lose pressure on the tires, that automatically, that is a huge deal. You can't land without your tires. You can't land safely. They'll have to bail out. But you can at least bail out, possibly. No one's tried it. But the moment you lose tire pressure, that was the moment when the pucker factor in mission control got turned up all the way. They knew when those tire pressures went away that it was real serious, and it wasn't just instrumentation. They had a huge problem on their hands. They knew. That wasn't really evident to us, but they knew. So it was, and then the communication started to drop out. They were trying to talk back and forth with the commander, Rick Husband, and there was the moment where Charlie Hobaugh, the Capcom, says, "We see your tire pressure messages and we cannot copy your last." Didn't understand what you just said, was what he was saying. Husband tries to respond and gets as far as and then he's cut off. And that was right at 8:59 and 32 seconds. The instant that all communication, everything was lost. And that's it. So if you know what's going on and know about the sensors going and know about the tire pressures going, and then communications get scratchy and disappear, then you know how grave it is and how frightening it is, how disastrous it might be. But we in the public weren't in on that. Mission Control, they were in on it. They knew what was going on.
The mission control tapes that we saw come out, there's some very eerie repeated calls to the shuttle, and then the flight director makes some instructions. Kind of walk us through what was on that tape and what you interpreted from the things that you saw.
Well, I saw that people who, as human beings, didn't want to believe what was happening, but who, as professionals, reacted appropriately and did what they needed to do, and there was nothing they could do in that case. At that point, it was gone already. What I find hard to forget is Leroy Kane saying, "Lock the doors," and his voice was husky, and his voice was like his throat was constricted, which, he knew too, just like I knew, but didn't come right out and say it. He knew too, but he didn't come right out and say it because he's going into the contingency procedures, Plan B. He's going to execute Plan B and do what he needs to do. So it is with, just absolute, you can almost, you can't feel what they felt, but you understand that your whole body viscerally and physically kind of reacts at a time like that, and your brain sort of goes into a different place. But you do your job and you try to do everything you can to play your part, and that's what Mission Control was doing. But that was a place that, like me, that I wish it hadn't happened. I would like to give everything back. They're in the same place. It's a horrible memory.
They kept trying to reach the shuttle. There was something that was repeated over and over and over. What was that? What was that? Why was that happening?
Right. Well, the one thing that they could try to do was reach the shuttle, the astronauts, and by using the words comm check, which is short for communications check. And they have different frequencies and different radios. It's kind of like FM and AM and shortwave, C-band. They have UHF. They have 2 or 3 different ways that they can talk to the space shuttle, and of course that's done because if one breaks, you have a backup. So they were trying all the backup systems, trying everything they could, and really there was nothing you could do by that time other than somehow hope that they were going to answer back, because communications do drop out during landing and during other times. That does happen. But happening in this scenario with all the other things happening, you knew this was different. But again, maybe comms are going to come back again. You got to at least check. And they were trying to reach them, and they kind of knew that nobody was going to answer back.
Just every time he said, Columbia, Houston, comm check, it just felt, you felt that. The gravity of each transmission, just heavier and heavier of what was happening.
Yeah, you could hear in Charlie's voice that every time he said it, he was losing hope a little bit more hope gone, a little bit more hope gone as he went away. And he, knowing what he knows, because he's an astronaut, and everybody in mission control knows the same thing anyway, whether they're astronauts or not, knowing what they know, it's sinking in, and it's going to take, it can't sink in right away. It's too horrible. You can't get your mind around that. And so you saw and felt and heard, and it's with great emotion and sympathy that you listen to this again, what they're going through. But you feel and hear disaster sort of seeping in and sinking in and becoming more and more real to them.
And they knew in that room, they knew Columbia was gone.
They knew, yes. They knew that, you don't bail out at 14,000 miles an hour. You don't bail out at 37 miles above. There's no way to do that and survive that, not even close. Make an emergency landing somewhere in like Texas or Louisiana because something is wrong with the space shuttle. No, you're 37 miles high. You can't get there. Not possible. They knew all that.
Does it feel like 20 years, Dan?
I would say that, yeah, a lot has happened since then. A lot has happened since then, and the space shuttle has transitioned to another thing. And when it comes and hits you, 20 years is kind of a long time, but yeah, it feels like 20 years.
I was curious about that. If it's one of those things where it was just like yesterday, or you remember it like yesterday, or if it fades over time.
Yeah, there are things that have faded, and I've gone back and looked and read and done things and said, oh yeah. And it hasn't been something that's been enjoyable to dwell on, but you also had to report on it, not just then, but for years. Report on that accident because it was so important. But yeah, it fades over time, but it doesn't go away.
What was it like to look back at your old stories and the broadcasts of that day?
Well, see, a couple of things. How dark my hair was. How much when you go double speed, when you speed up the tapes because you're in a hurry and you want to listen to the thing in half the time, that I sound just like Jim Payne. You should try that and play it. Maybe the audience will think the same thing. But yeah, some of the things that kind of relearning about the part. Some of the things that just kind of hit you, like there wasn't any there. They actually had a safety organization that was that bad, that was just a shell. And going back and saying, oh yeah, how could they have done that? How in the world could they have done that? How in the world could they not have said failure is not an option, we're going to do something about it, rather than, well, there's nothing we can do. How could they have done that? Yeah, seeing and kind of feeling and reading that again, it's like, I still don't believe it. you know.
Dan, you mentioned some military satellites and how they could have used, and this is going more into the investigation. What could have they, you know, there's some contingencies that could have happened that, you know, could have happened. You know, they said that they found more oxygen and more water on there than they thought, and that they might have been able, into a perfect scenario, get them back. Can you kind of talk about that, and then also the, you know, at least checking with military satellites to see if they could see the damage?
Yeah, the team at the Kennedy Space Center wanted to use military facilities, which are classified or semi-classified. We don't really know exactly where they are and exactly what they do, but suffice it to say, there are ways that the military has of getting pictures of things in space and getting pretty good pictures of them. And the team here wanted to do that, and the military was willing to do it. In fact, called NASA several times saying, hey, we're ready to go. We'll do this for you. You want us to do it? No, you don't? Okay, call them back. Are you sure you don't want us to do this? Because we can. We're happy to do it. We got it ready to go. You don't? Okay. So that happened. That the folks on the ground here at Kennedy couldn't make the managers listen to get military classified systems to take pictures that might have helped. They might have shown the damage. Then again, they might not have. This is not perfect. It's not easy to do. But you might as well do it and try, but they didn't want to try. They didn't want to bother the military, it seemed like. It kind of came across that they didn't want to do that. So that was one of the things that just, you know, when you have a safety mindedness, you should do. And it just didn't happen, even though the military was willing to make it happen. What the chairman of the Accident Investigation Board did was to have kind of the same reaction that a lot of people had of, what do you mean failure is an option? You know, go back and be the NASA of old times and do and try to figure it out. Now, all hands on deck, hell for leather effort to try to rescue this shuttle crew. Could you have done it if you tried? And they made some assumptions which weren't quite true. One of which was that if you knew that there was damage on Columbia, they didn't know. And even if they'd gotten the military pictures, they might not have known. So you had to assume that they knew that there was damage that they couldn't return with. Assuming that, what would you do? Well, yes, they found a way that they could hang on in space for a couple weeks longer than they might have otherwise thought. That there was a space shuttle down here, right there in the VAB. Well, it wasn't in the VAB yet, but the boosters and tank were, where they could have put a shuttle into that VAB, got its tank and boosters on, rolled it out there to the launch pad and launched it in time to go get the crew. They could have figured it out. It would have been a life and death decision. Do you want to risk the second crew as, you know, possibly having the same fate as Columbia? Or do you want to just somehow say goodbye to these people in orbit who are going to die on their spaceship, whether they try to re-enter or whether they just die on their spaceship? Can you kind of sit by and just let that happen, or do you bring them home? That would have been the decision they would have had to have made in this scenario if they mounted this rescue effort. But what came back was, there is something you can do. You can try, and you can actually have a plausible chance, a reasonable chance of succeeding. Maybe you wouldn't succeed, but you can say that of any space flight. Maybe it won't succeed. Maybe they'll die. So there was, in fact, something you could do. It may not have worked, but there was something that was at least plausible and reasonable that they could have tried.
What happened to the people in charge who made these decisions?
What happened to the people in charge who made the decisions were that the investigation board decided that it wasn't going to be a witch hunt. It wasn't going to be the type of thing where people would be held accountable and, you know, sort of made a public scapegoat of and have to live with that for the rest of their lives. That they would get much more cooperation and information from people who would be told, you know, you're not going to be blamed, you're also not going to be fired, you're not going to be arrested, none of this, you're fine, you just need to tell us the truth. And so that was the approach that they took, because getting at the truth was the most important thing. So everybody kind of got amnesty, and everybody, you know, nobody did anything wrong on purpose. They all thought they were doing their jobs, and they learned better, and they kept on going. And you know, the people who made the wrong decisions continued making decisions, only trying to make better ones, and you know, having a new routine in doing that.
Did we ever hear reaction from the families of the astronauts to the investigations?
Yes, some of them have spoken publicly about it, and you know, it's just like Rick Husband's wife, very forgiving person. That's what she gets from their shared faith as Christians. The astronauts actually told people in a couple of cases, if I die, I think it was Dave Brown who told a friend of his, an acquaintance of his, you know what, it could happen. This is before, obviously, before launch. You know, it could happen that we all die and we don't come home. And it could happen that somebody's going to get the finger pointed at them and be the scapegoat. So I, Dave Brown, am going to tell you, my friend, you promised me, you go to that guy and tell him Dave Brown doesn't blame you. Dave Brown did this because he thought he should do it, and nobody's going to be to blame. You know, Dave Brown had the choice to go or not. A couple of the astronauts had left things behind saying, don't blame people, forgive and keep exploring space even if I die. They said that.